Hey class, I'm going to give you a little lecture on James Baldwin, specifically Sonny's Blues. But before kind of getting into that, I want to give a very brief biographical background on Baldwin. I'm not planning on doing this for Cisneros or O'Brien, the other two authors you're reading, but I wanted to talk about Baldwin just because I think his biography, his background is particularly interesting. Because Baldwin grew up in the Harlem Renaissance, and you recall I talked about how important the Harlem Renaissance was. Specifically, I should point out, so he was born in 1924, so he grew up in the shadow of the Harlem Renaissance. That is, obviously when you're like 5 or 6 years old, you probably aren't all that aware of the music and poetry that's happening around you. I should be really careful. He didn't grow up in the Harlem Renaissance. He grew up in the shadow of the Harlem Renaissance, right? So by the time he was a teenager, like in the mid 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance, the height of the Harlem Renaissance was over. As if you recall, it ends in 1929. But a lot of the important writers and thinkers and painters and musicians are still there, right? I mean, the movement isn't quite as big as it was, but it's still there. And so Baldwin kind of grows up in this very culturally rich environment. Now, Baldwin, though himself, comes from an interesting background. So his stepfather is a minister, right? Is a storefront preacher. That is in New York City and a lot of other urban areas. There aren't churches in the traditional sense. They're storefronts. So it's like imagine like a strip mall, right? There's a 7-Eleven, there's a shoe store, and then there's a church. And that's how a lot of churches, were created or existed in places like New York and Chicago. Again, because you're in the middle of a big city, there isn't a big open area just for a standalone church. So James Baldwin's stepfather is a pastor, and I should also point out Baldwin's last name, it comes from his stepfather. It's not his biological given name. When he was a very young child, Baldwin's mother basically left Baldwin's biological father. No one really knows anything about him other than that he was, I guess, somewhat abusive, had a problem with drugs. So, anyways, Baldwin's mother takes him. They move to Harlem, and she eventually marries this minister, right? Minister Baldwin. So, anyhow, so Baldwin is actually thinking that he too might become a minister. He grows up in the church. He finds some of the writings fascinating. But of course, that's not the direction he goes in, and for several reasons. I mean, one is that he begins to, at a very young age, begins to garner a great appreciation for art and literature. He starts to write plays, and some of his teachers at school begin to recognize his great talent in him. He gets scholarships to go to some very nice schools. He's basically on this path, like this great intellectual pursuit. Except that his stepfather, right, is kind of against it. His stepfather is very uncomfortable with what's happening, and his stepfather. I think I don't want to say his stepfather was abusive, but let's say his stepfather was very oppressive, right? He didn't like what he saw happening. And part of it had to do with, I think, a certain suspicion that about Baldwin's sexuality. Because Baldwin is gay. And, he knew this. Baldwin himself realized this at a young age, of course. But, as he grew older and his father began to sense that, he wasn't like the other boys, I think there was this sort of very hostile feelings about the possibility that his stepson might be gay. And so that had a lot to do with it. Ultimately, in 1948, when Baldwin is 24 years old, Baldwin realizes sort of two things. One, that it's really hard to be a black man in America. And number two, it's really hard to be a gay black man in America, right? sort of he has these two strikes against him, that he's gay and he's black, and he's just not going to be able to thrive in a meaningful way. So in 1948, he does what to him seems like the most common sense thing to do, which is go move to Paris. And I talked about this a little bit uh, earlier in the quarter. Um, and this was also part of that extra credit assignment for passing strange. And I talked about the whole idea of the expat, right? The expatriate, the person who um, leaves one country to go to another country. And now this is a little bit different than being an immigrant, right? When you're an immigrant, you go to, like, an immigrant comes to America with the idea that America is going to be that person's new home, right? This is where you're planning on settling down. An expat is someone who moves to another country without that intention. And even though that person, like Baldwin, may live the rest of their lives in that country, it's never quite that sense that, like, I'm here to make this my home, right? So, there's a lot of people who, let's say, like, come to the United States to work for Amazon, and they come here for 2 or 3 years, and they know they're just going to work for 3 years, and they're going to go back to their home country. So those people would be called expats. Again, a lot of it has to do with sort of your personal intention, like, what are you feeling? Is this a place you are now going to call home? Then you'd be an immigrant. Is this the place that you're going to live for a certain undetermined amount of time? Then you would be an expat. Anyhow, so there are a lot of expats, right? And in Europe during the first half of the 20th century, a lot of American expats. I mean, most famously, you have writers like Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, right? I think quite a few of you mentioned liking the book The Great Gatsby, right? So these guys, Hemingway and Fitzgerald, were all expats, Americans who were living in Europe, most of the time usually in Paris. And of course, for African American artists and writers and musicians, a lot of them chose the same thing. Richard Wright, who is James Baldwin's sort of mentor, right, the person that James Baldwin looked up to, he had moved to Paris many years earlier, and so again, it made total sense to Baldwin that he too would move to Paris. So he does this again in 1948. And the thing is, even though he moves to Paris, right, he never really writes about his life in Paris, because that's not what he's concerned with. He moves to Paris because he wants to sort of simply thrive and experience this sense of humanity, right? He wants to just be a man, and he doesn't want the sort of confining limits of being black. Now, again, he's an expat. He lives in Paris, but Paris is not home, and Paris is not something he really thinks much about. Right? Let me rephrase that. It's not something that concerns him enough that it becomes a central point of his writing. He's written articles and stuff about life in Paris, but really the bulk of his writing, most of his time, is spent thinking about the United States, thinking about the role of race in the United States and what life is like for a black person and a gay black person in the United States, right? So, I mean, that's his sort of key obsession. In some ways, he's not unlike another famous expat named James, in this case, James Joyce, right, who is from Ireland. And, during the early 1900s, I mean, Ireland is a very strong Catholic nation, right? I mean, the Catholic religion is very much a central part of not only the culture, but of also politics. And there's also, again, a lot of political turmoil. There's a lot of talk about revolution. There's, constant wars with England. For most of you, when you think of the word terrorist or terrorism, obviously the image that most immediately pops up are, right, Muslims and ISIS and all that kind of stuff. But in fact, when I was growing up as a kid in the 1980s, when you heard terrorism, it usually meant the Irish. That there was, a lot of sort of terrorist attacks happening in England and Ireland because of this political conflict between England and Ireland for independence, and this is something that goes all the way back to like the 1850s. I mean, anyhow, the whole point is that there was a lot about Ireland that was difficult, and Joyce just really hated living there, and so he moved to Paris. But again, like Baldwin, James Joyce wrote exclusively about Ireland. His first collection of short stories was called The Dubliners, right? That he is focused really on life in Ireland. And to some extent, he feels like he needed to move out of Ireland to really be able to write about it. That when you're living in the turmoil, it's hard to reflect. It's hard to sort of take that time to really think about what's happening. And Baldwin felt very much the same way, that for him to really reflect on what's happening in America and on, again, specifically regarding race and sexuality, for him to really reflect on that, he had to step away. He had to sort of move away and create some kind of distance. Now, Baldwin first really hits it big in 1953 with the publication of Go Tell It on a Mountain. And this is a semi-autobiographical novel. That is, it's a novel, but it's very loosely based on his own life. And this was a smash success, both in terms of sales, it sold a lot of copies, as well as in terms of critical praise. Right? Critics loved this. They thought this was such a great new voice in American literature. Now, I mean, Baldwin was known. I mean, he didn't come out of nowhere, but he was known because he wrote short pieces, articles. He had written a play. People in sort of the most elite literary circles knew about him, but he hadn't yet made kind of a big national impact. And Go Tell It on the Mountain is the book that sort of really puts him on the map. It everyone at that point really sort of begins to know who James Baldwin is. Both again in America as well as internationally. He becomes a huge figure. And then 2 years later, he follows it up with a collection of essays called Notes of a Native Son. And this is simply a series of essays about a whole lot of different things, but ultimately it's essays about what he thinks of race in America, of blackness in America. And Baldwin basically becomes something of a minor celebrity. And it might be a little bit difficult for us to understand today because, when you watch Jimmy Kimmel or you watch The Tonight Show with Stephen Colbert, you almost never see authors, right? It's mostly just, TV stars and whatever, movie stars and musicians, whatever. You rarely see poets and playwrights on those shows. Well, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was actually like a regular thing that you would have like some big movie star, like let's say Robert De Niro, and then you'd have James Baldwin, right? This was, I don't want to say common, but it was not unusual. It happened frequently, and so people like James Baldwin were on lots of talk shows, and so even the average American who might not read lots of literature or any literature would still kind of know the name James Baldwin just because he was this guy who showed up on talk shows. And it's kind of sad like we really don't have that anymore. Anyhow, so he becomes something of a minor celebrity. At this point, though, he's kept his sexuality hidden, right? The fact that he's gay. There's some hints at it in Go Tell It on the Mountain, but it's not very explicit. Later, he publishes a book called Giovanni's Room. And earlier I said, like Baldwin doesn't really write very much about his life in Paris. Giovanni's Room is the one exception. Giovanni's Room is very much about being a gay man in Paris. Giovanni is this Italian bartender that the speaker falls in love with, right? Um, and this becomes again like a very explosive book because it is very explicit about its homosexuality. It's a book that becomes very quickly banned in a lot of places. There are a lot of cities that refuse, to let bookstores sell this book, right? And the libraries can't have it. Like, it was considered obscene. Um, not that there was any like graphic sexual things going on in these books, but simply, it was obscene simply because it was involved gay men. He would actually publish another very sort of explicit novel about homosexuality called Another Country, and this novel took place in New York City. So again, by the '60s, Baldwin is very out. He's very open and very public and outspoken about you know both again his sort of black and gay identities, and something that he very freely talks about. Whether it's in an article that he writes or whether it's in an interview for a talk show on TV. For those of you who might be interested, a really excellent documentary came out last year called "I Am Not Your Negro," and this is a collection of James Baldwin speaking. Right? You see clips of him on talk shows. You'll see clips of him in news interviews, and then you'll hear audio tape of when reporters interviewed him. It's a fascinating documentary, and especially because it allows Baldwin to sort of speak for himself. Definitely worth checking out. All right, so with that said, I think I'm going to end this lecture here, and then in the next section, dig into Sonny's Blues.